people perform in the same physical activities at completely different levels of performance, and we're looking to highlight that in the conversation of what it means to learn human movement. And we're going to start off by doing something really, really simple. We're going to draw in, and I encourage you to do the same. We're going to draw in a continuum. Okay, so we've got this continuum here. It's going to have a little endpoint here, although in reality, theoretically, I suppose it goes on forever. And what we're going to do here is we're going to sort of shade it very uglily in just some basics. So we're going to have this sort of part of the continuum here. Let me just make it a little bit broader. Sort of shade here. I know this is going to be ugly and you're going to laugh at me for my drawing skills, but we've got this part of the continuum here. And finally, we've got this part. Let me go for an orange. Not to eat one, I mean to draw with one. And then we've got this part of the continuum here. Okay, so now I've got this daft, silly shading. Probably should have chosen a different pen type. What am I trying to get? What am I trying to get at with this concept? No, the first thing I'd like you to realize is that what we're saying here is that we're going from the most fundamental level of performance, being able to walk, being able to put our hand to a particular point, to the most skilled. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So each of these sort of shaded areas represents a grouping, a series of characteristics that would suggest, right, we're in this kind of broad group when we're performing something, or we're in this kind of broad group when we're performing something, or we're in this broad group when we're performing something. And let's give these stages a name. The first stage is what we would call the cognitive stage. Cognition means to think about, or to think. So therefore, the cognitive stage means you have to think through the skill and how to perform it, more details of which in a second. This pink stage is what we'd call the associative phase. The associative phase, we are going through associative learning models in order to refine and remove errors within our performance, more details of which in a second. And the final one is what we call the autonomous stage. And autonomous kind of feels a bit like automatic, doesn't it? And what it means here is that we're kind of performing without conscious thought or without conscious control of what we're doing. It's more automatic in our performance. But what I'd like you guys to realize is that these areas overlap, okay? And also movement can be forward and back along this continuum. Now, broadly speaking, people move up to be more skilled through their lifetime, but it is possible also to move backwards. So let's put some characteristics of each of these in. So what about this cognitive thing? What does it mean to be in the cognitive stage of learning? Well, how do we characterize this? And I guess one of the first things I'm not just going to get you a mark, but we often find this is very common with children. Okay, so first access to a sporting experience. How would we describe this? So let's put some characteristics in. We're talking about this being related to beginners. A nice word for you to use is the idea of novices. Novices, this is someone who's just started doing some beginners or novices at this more fundamental level. Really important point coming up here. The performers learn through what we call a mental picture. Okay, so they create a picture in their mind of the correct skill, and then they look to replicate that skill. And of course, that really for us has implications for the importance of a demo. Okay, and a correct demo, or let's call it a demonstration. The importance of a demo, because the people learning in this stage are relying on the accuracy of that demonstration. So it's super important. And we could, of course, start to talk about visual guidance, but let's just keep it here for now. These performers are making many and repeated errors. So again, if we're coaching these performers, what is the role of an error in the coaching environment? Is an error bad or is an error good? Is an error normal or normalized? And is an error something which we use to build upon and improve the performance in the future? If it's something which is bad, of course, let me stop that point. If there's something that's deemed as wrong or negative, then of course we're going to have a problem, because they're very common in this stage of learning. Next, the performers tend to have a lack of consistency in their performance. Okay, so they don't have a consistent technical approach to what they're doing. Sometimes we describe the movements. I always find it hard to write this word in like a GCSE level, but jerky, non-smooth. Okay, let's say non-smooth maybe. And this is a really important point, so I'm going to come back to in a second. They have no feeling of the correct skill. No feeling of the correct skill. So in other words, if we come back to the idea of intrinsic feedback for a second, they can't really use that feeling feedback because they don't know what correct feels like yet. So no feeling of the skill. So that kind of kinesthetic knowledge is not there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the associative phase. Now, of course, remember that performers are moving from one phase into the next and back potentially. So let's have a look at the associative phase. How do we? I think it's often the trickiest one to get to grips with. Let me actually call it the associative stage of learning. Let's see if we can get to grips with this associative stage of learning. So what are the characteristics? We call this the practice phase because there's a lot of repetition and there's a lot of practice, some of which is successful, some of which is not, more of which in a second. The performer develops, get ready for this, develops the feeling of the skill, So in this stage, the performer starts to have a kinesthetic knowledge of what correct feels like. And of course, that's very potent. That's very important for the performer because it means that they can then improve rapidly from that point. So as a result, we get a very common experience of what we call error detection and correction. Okay, error detection and correction. So the main processes involved in coaching in this model, in this phase, is detecting errors and correcting those errors. We still say that this is still not skill, still inconsistent, however. So we've still got inconsistencies and errors are still relatively common. Okay, but we've got a very, very different experience here of what it means to be a learner. And of course, what we're talking about now, if we're saying, right, we're now moving from this associative phase into this autonomous phase. How would you describe this autonomous phase of learning? Autonomous with an O-U-S stage of learning. Okay, so what are our characteristics here? Okay, so first things first, we want to say here that this is what we might call the expert stage, or you could call it elite breed. I prefer the term expert in this context. Look what we're going to say here. The movement is smooth. It's clean. We're going to say here that the movements are consistent. We could even use the word habitual if you want to be hyper accurate. The skill becomes habitual. It's a habit for the performer. The performer has a very clear feeling of the skill. There's an I in there. Feeling of the skill. Okay, so their kinesthetic knowledge, their feeling of correctness is very, very acute. They understand. This is extremely useful for what we'd call intrinsic feedback. Intrinsic feedback. Was I right or wrong? Did I make any errors? What can I improve on? And fine. Well, 2 more points actually. 2 more points. We get the notion of refinement of skill. So the skill is really well learned by this point. Refinement of the skill. So we're looking at the refinement and the application of the skill, really. And finally, we're looking at the skill being, and we mentioned this word right at the start, automatic. Okay, and I like to add the term here, subconscious. The performer does not need to consciously control the movement. It happens automatically. They give a command for the movement to occur, and it happens automatically. Now, we're not going to get into schemas and executive motor programs at this point, but that's an area of study that this might develop you into later on. So, remember that these phases overlap. Remember that the coaching environment is important to acknowledge where learners are within their phasing, and we should be able to produce coaching environments which are therefore relevant for different athletes.